The first questions on the list will focus on the foundations of our health, specifically the quality of our sleep and the foods and substances we put into our bodies. Let's go over sleep. Do you struggle with falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early? And beyond that, do you often feel fatigued even after what should be enough rest? The duration and quality of our sleep can suffer if, for example, we eat too late into the night, if we are chronically exposing ourselves to blue light in the evening through the use of our devices, if there's too much sound or noise in the background, if you fall asleep with videos or TV in the background, if you are taking certain substances that make it harder to fall and stay asleep, if you aren't eating enough calories or losing weight too fast, leading to insomnia. Working out or running too much after 7 p.m. can sometimes make it harder to fall asleep too. By the way, for those who need a peer-reviewed paper to prove to you how the things I just mentioned affect the quality and duration of sleep, modernity has rendered you a bit senseless, and you need to measure things for yourself. Poor sleep affects mood and cognition, and if it continues long enough, it can push the brain into a psychotic state. At the extreme end, severe or prolonged sleep deprivation can lead to hallucinations and paranoia. Even 1 or 2 nights of poor sleep can make people more easily annoyed and less patient. Chronic sleep deprivation is strongly linked to sadness, hopelessness, and lack of motivation. Lack of rest heightens the brain's stress response, making people more anxious and emotionally reactive. I hope you're starting to see why the lack of sleep can affect our interpersonal interactions at home or at work and further evoke discontent and depression in our lives. For example, you had terrible sleep for the last 4 days and you broke into an unnecessary shouting match with your spouse. That argument could result in more stress and a propensity towards depression. Cycle of body, mind, society. For those who live with others, you might discover that on the way to getting better sleep, you'll need to solicit help from those you live with. Maybe you need to ask your roommate if they can be more quiet when they enter the apartment, or you'll need to establish house rules like no loud music past 7 p.m. On the other hand, getting better sleep could look like opting out of social events or leaving them early. That company-sponsored happy hour or that late-night invite might have to take the back seat. Let's try to turn that fear of missing out, FOMO, into JOMO, joy of morning optimism. Yeah, or joy of missing out. Yeah, it is very cheesy. It's cheesy and that's okay. You know what isn't cheesy? Getting good sleep. Getting good sleep is just basic, fundamental for our mental health. Something that seems so simple is in reality extremely difficult for others. Not everybody lives in a quiet neighborhood with supportive individuals or has a career that optimizes for good sleep. The choices we make in our careers drastically impact when, how, and where we sleep. I wish I could say that good sleep is easily obtainable by everyone, but I understand that things are a lot more complicated than that. And just to remind you, the cycle, mind, society, connection, even some relationships or friendships aren't good for our sleep. I know it sounds drastic, but like if you have a friend that's constantly nagging you to go out at like 11 p.m. and you're suffering from mental health issues, you know that you need good rest because it's going to help you in the long run towards better mental health, then that relationship is something that you might want to reflect on, whether or not it's maybe being expressed in the right way. Maybe you need to set some boundaries with your friend and let them know, hey, I can only hang out with you from this time to this time, and these are the times that I'm free, and if it doesn't work for us, it's okay. Maybe some other time in some other phase of my life, it will. But for now, I'm prioritizing my sleep because it's good for my mental health. Yeah, I know it sounds cheesy, but getting good sleep is not cheesy. It's just fundamental. It's like basic. It's the most basic thing that we need to be doing for better mental health. I don't think we've heard enough about sleep, but I'm going to move on for now. The next questions include, have you used recreational drugs or alcohol recently? If so, how often and how much? Are you sensitive to caffeine? Moving past the recreational, are you currently taking any medications? And if so, have you noticed changes in mood or energy since? I've said this before, that it doesn't take a lot for the chemistry in our bodies to change for the worse. If you're using recreational drugs or you're abusing your medication, remember that the higher up you go in pleasure, the worse the come down is. Remember that after too much artificial stimulation from things like drugs, gambling, music, or even constant social media, the brain adapts by lowering dopamine sensitivity. This makes ordinary pleasures feel dull, leading to cravings for stronger stimulation just to feel a sense of normal. It's often referred to as dopamine downregulation or having a decreased dopamine baseline or the hypodopaminergic state. When we are either seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting things that elevate our pleasure way through the roof, we might begin to experience anhedonia, which is the clinical term for the reduced ability to feel pleasure, often observed after chronic drug use or behavioral addictions. When the things that should naturally bring you pleasure, like your family, friends, loved ones, hobbies, going outside, reading, etc., no longer appear to be enough, it's easy to see how depression could follow as a result. It's why it's important to dwell in gratitude for the things that bring us real sustenance in our lives. That brings me to the next question, which is, how would you describe your nutrition? I want to tie the idea of anhedonia, the reduced ability to feel pleasure, and dopamine downregulation, lower dopamine sensitivity, when discussing nutrition, depression, and specifically highly palatable foods. Those are foods that are probably too high in sugar, fat, and salt. They often contain natural flavors and textures designed in such a way that they leave us wanting more. If you're struggling with depression, here's a word of caution about highly palatable foods. The pleasure from highly palatable foods can be available to us in dark times when what we need the most is emotional support. And if and when that emotional support is lacking, highly palatable foods can serve as a function similar to what a pacifier is to a baby. Except this pacifier comes with calories, weight gain, and possible addiction. This can happen with the use of other substances too. But I want to use this example to highlight the risk of food addiction. The word pacifier comes from the verb to pacify, which means to make peace or calm. When we use food, the sense of fullness in our stomachs, or any other substance for that matter, to cope through a challenging time or to calm the stress, what we pretend to be doing is making peace with the challenges of our circumstances, albeit in shallow ways. This sense of relief isn't only artificial and transient. It promotes complacency and addiction. It doesn't grapple with the root issues causing us stress, and if we are munching on highly addictive foods or substances, we are pushing us in the direction of anhedonia, the reduced ability to feel pleasure. The consequences vary and have an impact on the rest of our lives. For example, instead of looking forward to playing with our kids and enjoying their smiles and laughs, we might start to look forward to that joint or cigarette we are going to smoke before or after. Instead of going to that social gathering for the sake of interacting with people whose brains we are genuinely eager to pick at, it becomes about whether or not food will be present and what kind of food will be there. Will I get to drink alcohol or smoke when I get there? In essence, we become pacifists in our own lives, no longer willing to fight for our natural sense to derive pleasure from what truly brings us meaning. This type of peacemaking isn't peaceful at all, and it can reinforce a positive feedback loop of depression. What we put into our mouths changes our depression for better or for worse. What we digest is personal, and I'll go further by claiming that it is spiritual. How do I know? Because if someone ate babies, you can easily guess that that person is not spiritually sound. And I take it to the extreme because we're out here not making any sense when we feed our bodies garbage or to constant excess and expect to feel normal. Let's use caffeine for example. Caffeine use has increased massively over the past 2 centuries. 200 years ago, most people had limited or occasional exposure to it. But today, it is a staple in people's lives. Caffeine is the most widely consumed psychoactive substance globally. Yet we seldom consider that we are all genetically diverse and some people metabolize caffeine very slowly. The gene called CYP1A2 controls an enzyme in the liver that breaks caffeine down. Different versions or alleles of that gene change how active this enzyme is. If you are carrying a variant of that gene that slows your ability to break down caffeine, you could be amongst the people who experience jitters after a latte. You could be amongst the people who experience heart palpitations and have a higher risk of insomnia. There are even rare occasions of people who lack the CYP1A2 gene. For those people, even small doses may cause very strong or prolonged effects. From what I read and gathered, about over 40% of the global population slowly metabolizes caffeine through all sorts of variants of that gene. If someone is experiencing depression or anxiety and they're unaware that they metabolize caffeine rather slowly, something as innocent as a Starbucks latte at 8 a.m. can leave them awake until 2 a.m. And if that person has work at 6 a.m., you can imagine how that person is going to feel the next day. The irony is that this person might arrive to the office and grab yet another cup of coffee without understanding that the previous dose hasn't been fully metabolized. And look at that. Maybe they actually have enough stamina and crush it at work that day until they come home and can't sleep again. The next day, irritability and anxiety is pent up. They're more suspicious of the people around them, so their interactions feel heavier than usual. A simple disagreement with their colleague that can otherwise be easily worked through becomes emotionally overwhelming. And again, it reinforces a positive feedback loop of depression. You can conjure up examples yourself that you deem more relevant. The point is that our genetics matter, and what we put into our bodies matter as well. Here's a personal example. You're going to have to pay me to stop saying that about 70% of the world is lactose intolerant, and dairy causes inflammation for a lot of us. I used to suffer from cystic acne. The acne was not only physically uncomfortable, but it gave me social anxiety. I was embarrassed to be around people when I was suffering from the type of acne that would show up on my throat. I felt it was embarrassing, and even after the acne was gone, it would leave scars on my skin. I felt that it was a job to cover it up. I can't say that it caused depression, but it definitely promoted feelings of inadequacy. I used makeup to cope, and I'd even begin to poke on my skin when things got stressful, making the acne worse. All the cosmetics and picking couldn't address the underlying issue, so I was finally inspired to go cold turkey. I cut out all dairy, no more cheese, and the hardest, butter. Butter is in everything. Pick up any chip bag as well. It seems like every product contains milk. It's annoying. But I also cut out all nuts because I needed to see what was affecting my acne. After a solid 4 months, my cystic acne disappeared, and I was obviously more confident. I also later learned that peanuts and soy tend to promote acne on my face alongside dairy. This is an example of how our biology affects our psychology, because I no longer see makeup as a way of covering up or a chore, but now it's about accentuating and expressing myself, and I have more confidence. All right, next, chronic physical health conditions like thyroid issues, diabetes, or autoimmune diseases can directly impact mood regulation, and you should inquire about them. Have you noticed any changes in appetite, weight, or digestion over time? How would you describe your energy levels throughout the day? Have you experienced major hormonal changes like puberty, pregnancy, menopause, PCOS, thyroid imbalance? Do you notice mood changes tied to your menstrual cycle, sleep cycles, or seasonal shifts? Have you ever been tested for conditions like anemia, vitamin D deficiency, or inflammation markers? Have you had recent blood work or lab tests? Were there any issues with vitamin levels, iron, or hormones? Have you experienced significant medical events like surgery, traumatic brain injury, major illness? What, if any, pollutants are you chronically exposed to? Look, I understand that access to healthcare varies and not everyone has the option to test for all, or even just some of these. But I bring these questions up so that we are reminded that our biology affects why, how, and when depression shows up in our lives. I want to read 3 examples that neatly underscore the intersection of biology and depression from the book titled Good Energy, written by Dr. Casey Means alongside with her brother Callie Means. The book argues that optimizing how your cells generate and use energy, what Dr. Casey Means describes as good energy, through diet, lifestyle, and our environments, is key to preventing chronic disease and unlocking long-lasting health. The first example highlights research showing how childhood antibiotic use can disrupt the microbiome and increase long-term risk for poor metabolic health and mental illness. Quote, "One of the most alarming research findings I've ever come across is that antibiotics in childhood increase the risk for mental health issues by an odds ratio of 1.44. Destroying the microbiome with aggressive antibiotics impacts gut function, metabolic function, and chronic inflammation, and it sets up the conditions for bad energy and subsequent problems like mental illness." End quote. And yes, I want to point out that correlation does not equal causation, but the interlink cannot be ignored. We can't keep ignoring things just because correlation does not equal causation. I love that in her book, Dr. Casey Means exposes the U.S. medical industry's propensity for compartmentalized healthcare, where inflammation and chronic disease is approached without a genuine investigation through the lens of a body as a multifaceted physiological system within societal systems. Here's another excerpt. Quote, more than 90% of serotonin, the hormone that regulates mood and contentment, is made in the gut, not in the brain. Anything that disrupts gut function, like bad energy physiology that leads to irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, can strongly impact mental health. Unsurprisingly, IBS and depression have a strong link, with IBS sometimes even being called depression of the gut. IBS, in fact, is often addressed with antidepressants. End quote. The next excerpt presents research linking poor metabolic markers like elevated glucose and triglyceride to HDL ratios to a significantly higher risk of developing depression. Quote, one study showed that every additional 18 milligrams per deciliter of fasting glucose was associated with a 37% increased rate of developing depression. Additionally, for every 1 unit increase in triglyceride to HDL ratio, people had an 89% higher likelihood of developing depression. End quote. Getting curious about our biology is important because even if we are within the regular body mass index or BMI range, there are metabolic red flags we could be missing. Red flags that, if left uncared for, could turn into depression. Similarly, there's a misconception that if you're overweight, you are not dealing with malnutrition. But carrying excess fat does not mean that you are consuming excess micronutrients. Most of the time, it's the opposite. A lot of people struggling with obesity are struggling with nutrient deficiencies. Micronutrient malnutrition, also called hidden hunger, happens when you get enough calories but not enough essential vitamins and/or minerals. Micronutrients are vitamins and minerals like vitamin A, iron, iodine, zinc, vitamin D, B12, etc. And even if we are getting enough of these, there could be a habit, environment, substances, or other circumstances preventing us from absorbing them or putting these macronutrients to good use. I also want to expand on the notion of how our biology affects depression. By the way, this can happen even to anyone regardless of their weight. But obesity is prevalent in America, and I think this particular example illustrates what happens more often than not. Let's say someone is morbidly obese, a condition that didn't happen overnight, and they get anxiety when they step out of the comfort of their home. Things like going to the grocery store become nerve-wracking. They think of the shame they would feel if someone they used to know spots them out and learns about the weight that they've gained over the years. They're also reluctant to put themselves in the dating market because they think they need to look a certain way to be in a relationship. They want to attend more social events, more religious gatherings, and even outdoor excursions with others, but they overanalyze. Not to mention, movement can also be hard on your joints if you're overweight. So that person convinces themselves that the safe route is being alone at home, scrolling on social media as they live vicariously through others. They might even compound the underlying issue by temporarily comforting themselves with food and maybe other substances. In this case, not only can a biological feature, the excess weight, propel other internal conflicts like sleep apnea, high blood pressure, etc., but it can also develop self-esteem issues and social anxiety affecting our psychology and sociology, opening the door for a positive feedback loop of depression. Maybe that person does go out, but they only choose to be around people who are also struggling with obesity and bought into body positivity to the extent that they ignore the potential negative consequences of their lifestyle. So maybe the people they're choosing to be around aren't even people they genuinely resonate with. Now they're in this familiar sense of being with others, yet so lonely. In this case, the depression is a symptom of a bigger biological issue. And a doctor can give that person antidepressants without simultaneously addressing that the root cause of their distress is the weight. An even bigger issue that needs attention could be not the weight itself, but whether or not the weight is a symptom of a coping mechanism this person acquired to feel a sense of security. It can also be a symptom of environmental influences in their home, work, or in the culture or cultures they interact with. These are things that are seldom drastically transformed overnight. Just a quick note, your body deserves love and respect at any size, and you can love your body and still want to change it. This was a very particular example, again with little nuance, and not everyone who is overweight struggles with depression. Since I'm practicing radical honesty, I want to share that binge eating or chronically eating past my satiety signals is something that I've done in the past to cope with stress. Those habits, which I acquired at such a young age, might have been overlooked and even encouraged by my friends and family. And so they may not be entirely my fault, but it is still my responsibility to address now. Sometimes genetic predisposition can increase our vulnerability to mood disorders, mental illness, and addiction. But I am team epigenetics all the way. What's on top of our biology matters the most. We didn't choose the cards we've been dealt with, but as soon as we acquire enough awareness, you can begin to play them best. That's all about lifestyle, behavior, environment. If we are taking steps to honestly mitigate depression in our lives, we cannot overlook our inputs. To put it in perspective, a single packet of sugar, like the ones you get at a cafe, contains about 1,000 milligrams of sugar. Fentanyl is so potent that just 2 milligrams, a tiny dusting that you could barely pinch between your fingers, can be enough to kill an average adult without opioid tolerance. So little can alter our physiology so much and in return affect our mental health. We are either building or diminishing our state of being with what we consume. Never mind drugs. I love how Dr. Casey Means puts it in her book when she says, quote, "In my practice, I will not see a patient unless they agree to temporarily keep a food journal. I can't counsel them if I don't know what 2 to 3 pounds of molecular information are going into their bodies every day. Imagine a patient taking 2 to 3 pounds of medications every day, but not telling the doctor what they are taking." End quote. Lastly, it's important to ask, is there a family history of depression, bipolar disorder, or other mental health conditions? Similarly, do you have close relatives being treated or not being treated for substance abuse? If you have a family history of substance abuse disorder and or depression, get on the wagon to be honest with yourself and others if you can afford to dabble with recreational drugs. The biology we're born with is not our fault, but it is our responsibility to work with and collaborate with. A very basic and drastic example is how a pregnant mother who is addicted to opioids continues to consume opioids during her pregnancy. This drug can cause physical dependence and cross the placenta, so when they give birth to a baby who has neonatal abstinence syndrome, NAS, where the newborn is born dependent and experiences withdrawal. I don't want to overlook that substances like cocaine, cannabis, alcohol, opioids can cause DNA fragmentation in sperm, raising risk of infertility, miscarriage, or developmental issues in offspring. Some studies suggest that drugs can trigger epigenetic changes, chemical modifications to sperm DNA that may pass on vulnerabilities, like the higher risk for metabolic or psychiatric issues to children. Look, if a child was born irrespective of their parents' drug addictions, that child was meant to exist. When and if that child becomes a healthy adult, they might be pressured to consume the very substances that diminish them in the direction of less life. That generational curse can continue or end through them. If there's a dual diagnosis risk, for example, someone could be experiencing depression and substance misuse, early awareness helps prevent overlooking one condition while treating the other. Let's say that someone is being prescribed antidepressants, but they don't share with their doctor that they're also struggling with alcoholism. If you're visiting a psychiatrist, a therapist, or any other medical professional to get help, why would you leave this detail out? Be honest, so you can get the best help that you need. I'm ending this chapter on the intersection of biology and depression, but I want to reiterate that it's not so simple to address our biology. We should feel very empowered, but I understand that what will often be the case is that to address our biology, we will need to address our psychology and sociology, and that addressing our biological issues for better mental health will often signify confronting even larger issues in our social and psychological worlds. Let's talk about our psychology.